Hey CW Apes, Mr. Kennedy here. This is your Chapter 7 lecture on sustaining biodiversity through an ecosystem approach. In past videos, we've talked about deforestation and, the impact it has on biodiversity. We've talked about, laws and regulations that have been passed to, help prevent deforestation. We've even looked at the restorative process to protect biodiversity and all of the intricacies that go along with that. Today what I want to do is just share with you what it would be like if we could just protect the ecosystem as a whole instead of always having to rely on fixing things after the fact. So we're going to spend a few minutes just going over the world's forests, the threats, fire management that's going on there, grasslands, and then finish with parks and preserves. Okay? So we're going to start with a little background on forests. Forests cover about 30% of the world's land surface. Grasslands also cover about 30% of the land surface. Now, that doesn't mean that forests cover 30% of the globe. No. That means that, if you think about our planet, like 70% of it is actually covered with water. So if you thought 30% was covered by forest, well, that would be everything else. That's not how it works. So of the 30% that's dry land, that has 30% of its space covered in forest and another 30% covered in grassland. So all the other terrestrial ecosystems cover that last 30%. So forests and grasslands, they're pretty abundant, and as such are pretty important. Those two ecosystems provide many essential resources for us to improve our day-to-day life and just make survival possible. Lumber, paper pulp, livestock grazing, that's all there. Regulating climate, controlling water runoff, purifying water and air, habitat for wildlife. I mean, it's easy to say that it's just pretty to look at too. All of those things create value for forests and for grasslands. Now, of the forests that are out there, well, to be defined a forest, you have to have an area where trees cover more than 10% of the land. So the largest remaining forests on the planet are actually found in cold, high latitude areas and humid equatorial areas. Using the definition of forest that I gave you, well, we end up looking at areas that span the globe from the open savannas, where trees cover less than 20% of land, to closed canopy forests where tree crowns actually overlap. This map will give you an idea of just the broad expanse of forests across the globe. One thing that I want you to think about is the connection between forests and people. And pretty much everywhere you see forest, you're probably also gonna see people. Okay? There are some exceptions to that. The largest tropical forests are in South America. South America has about 22% of the world's forest and the largest undisturbed tropical rainforest. There are stretches of tropical rainforest in South America that are completely inhospitable and inaccessible to man. There are still some indigenous tribes that live in these areas that literally have no knowledge of the modern world. North America and Eurasia have vast areas of unaltered boreal forests, but those areas are shrinking. Primary forests or old growth forests are those forests that are made up of largely native species where there's very little indication of human activity. And really those old growth forests in those places like North America and Eurasia that haven't seen the much human impact, those areas are kind of like the nursery for incredible numbers of valuable life forms, whether they be plant or animal or somewhere in between. Okay? They're home for much of the world's biodiversity, ecological services, and even indigenous human cultures. The status of these forests, well, a third of all the world's forests being primary forests means that there's a lot of untouched land out there yet to be harvested, and there are a lot of people that look at that and through simply the lens of financial gain. There's 6 million hectares of these forests that are cleared or heavily damaged every single year to that end, financial gain, or in some places maybe it's just a survival strategy. I'll show you what I mean in a minute. 9 out of 10 of the countries where 80% of our forests exist are actually experiencing unsustainable logging rates, which basically means we're cutting the trees faster than the trees can grow back. Why, you say? Well, we're not considering the long term. We're only considering the here and now. Here's a case in point. 50% of forests across the globe are actually harvested for little more than firewood. They're not harvested for anything that's going to last longer than maybe a few minutes as it burns. And I know what you're saying. Well, why would people do this? Because they have no other way to survive. Not every part of the globe is as fortunate as you might be here in the United States with running water, fresh and clean from the faucet, electricity, natural gas, all of those things plumbed directly to your house so that it's easy to prepare a meal or even stay warm during the winter months or cool during the summer. So if you don't live under those conditions, like, this is how you need to survive. You're not burning wood for the aesthetic value or beauty of a campfire. You're burning it because that's the only way you can cook your food. Okay? To give you an idea of what forest destruction is going on in places like Brazil, here's 3 pictures that were taken over the span of just a couple of decades. In 1975, on the far left, you can see the full green canopy of the forest in Brazil, compared to 2001, where you can see the slash and burn strategies and how those have affected the forest. Now, aside from fuel wood, the forest provides a wealth of paper products. And if you're like everybody else in the United States, you use a lot of paper products. Developed countries, well, they provide less than half of the industrial wood that's out there, but consume like 80% of the wood in the industrial market. Paper pulp is 1/5 of all wood consumption, which basically means we're going to take a tree, grind it up, mix it with water, bleach it, and make like paper, or toilet paper, or tissue, or paper towels, or napkins, stuff like that. All that comes from paper pulp. Fuel accounts for half of the global wood use. You saw that. And 1/4 of the world's forests are managed for wood production. A quarter, right? A fourth. That's a massive amount of wood. Much of the wood is replanted in a single monoculture forestry strategy that I showed you in our deforestation lectures. So I don't want to rehash something we already know, but taking old growth forests and replacing it with monoculture, that's not sustainable. If you plant monoculture and something makes one tree sick, it's gonna make all the trees sick. There have been successful reforestation programs in places like China, Korea, and Japan, right? But they don't reforest by simply planting those monocultures. Tropical forests occupy less than 10% of the land surface, but contain half of all plant and animal and microbial species on Earth. The sad thing about tropical forests is there's 30,000 hectares that are removed every single day. Like literally more than a football field an hour is slashed and burned and never to return. Replanting or succession accounts for revegetation of about 5.7 million hectares per year. And if you just do a little math, that means that even though we are replanting and trying to revegetate some of these areas, we're still losing 7.3 million hectares per year, and they're not being replaced. At the current rate of deforestation, no primary forest will be left in most countries outside of parks or preserves by the end of the century. That's crazy. Causes of deforestation, well, again, in terms of tropical forests, it's not just fuel wood. We're trying to convert the area for people to, grow crops. If your land is covered by tropical rainforest, you have to ask the question, how do I become self-sustaining and grow enough food to feed all of the people of a large city like Brazil, okay? A large country like Brazil. How am I supposed to do that? Well, that's where the slash and burn comes into play. That's where large expanses of forests are removed and they're replaced by, rows of crops or flocks of sheep and cattle. Conversion of forest to agriculture accounts for 2/3 of the destruction that we see in Africa. The African savanna and the forests of Africa, they can't recover, quickly at all. Once that area has been wiped out, even if people leave and go away, the inevitable barren landscape will follow. Conversion to cattle ranching and soy farming are the most common, things that we see in Latin America. Large-scale commercial logging is really at fault for all of this deforestation. They build roads to remove trees. This also allows entry to the forest by farmers, miners, and hunters. That increases pollution, erosion, invasive species. It fragments once contiguous pieces of habitat, creating an edge effect where the edges are dry and more susceptible to fire. Fires destroy 350 million hectares of forest per year. And many of those fires are actually set intentionally. It's not accidental. They set them intentionally so that they can simply have an easier way to clear the land. That's what this is all about, okay? I don't want to have to cut all these trees down, so I'll just kind of maybe make a road and then go along the edge of the road and set the forest ablaze. So looking at causes of deforestation from our previous lecture, there's no easy and single thing to point at as the one reason why forests are under stress. One last thing that I want you to think about in terms of forest stress is biofuel production and palm oil plantations. So biofuel production is responsible for forest destruction in Southeast Asia, where basically we're harvesting things like sugar beets and using those to make fuel for cars. And palm oil plantations, those are kind of like the bane of all evil throughout the tropics. Palm oil might not be something you think about every day, but the list of products that palm oil can be found in is huge. Everything from cosmetics to the foods that we eat, and as a result, that there's a huge market for palm oil coming out of the tropics. So they're just chopping these forests down and they're planting the palms so that they can make a buck that way. The bad thing about palm oil plantations is to harvest the palm oil, you have to take the entire plant. And so that means you're constantly moving through the forest, planting more palms, and there's not a huge return for your effort. So it takes a massive amount of space to make even a small amount of money, right? That palm oil really is at the heart of the degradation and destruction that we see in the tropics. So that brings us to forest protection. Some places are actually being protected and reforested, as we've talked about in past videos. About 12% of the world's forests are now protected. 12%. Africa has the largest protected area by percentage because Africa's huge, okay? Guanacaste National Park in Costa Rica is kind of like a model area for forest guardianship. And what we're seeing in national parks like this is basically the removal of human impact and nature bouncing back on its own and becoming self-sustaining again. That combination of high biodiversity and high species abundance is, well, it's winning the day and helping these forests survive. The whole ecosystem needs to be protected, not just a single tree or a single lower plant or a small animal that might be cute or interesting, but the entire ecosystem. Through the formation of national parks, whole ecosystems can be preserved intact so that biodiversity can be sustained long term. Brazil is actually a leader in establishing forest reserves, and their claim to fame now isn't so much like palm oil plantations or cattle or sheep. It's ecotourism, right? And so they're making money off of ecotourism more than they're making money off of old practices that just resulted in the slash and burn and destruction of their forests. All right, people are also protecting local forests. The Chipko Andolan movement in India is a great case in point of people, women, who basically stepped in to protect the forests of India. Women literally hugged trees in a non-violent protest to prevent loggers and preserve firewood for their families. There's even the idea of debt for nature swaps, where conservation organizations will actually buy debt obligations and then offer to cancel the debt if a debtor country will protect the biologically important areas. Temperate forests are also threatened. Although the total forests in North America has actually remained constant for the last several years, forest management policies in the US and Canada do continue to be controversial. Large areas of the temperate rainforest in the Pacific Northwest have actually been set aside to protect endangered species, but logging is still allowed in the surrounding lands. Road building in the wilderness areas is especially controversial because it causes erosion and it allows for the potential of for extractive activities like mining and the introduction of invasive species. Other threats to the temperate forests include climate change, insect threats, wildfires. All of these things can disrupt the interconnectedness of the forest. As global temperatures begin to rise, it can trigger droughts, makes the trees more susceptible to insect infestation and even fire. That brings us to the idea of fire management. The U.S. has had a policy of aggressive fire control for really the past 70 years. And while it's protected human life and, economics, structures, things like that, I think what we're starting to see now is the negative ramifications of such a practice in forests. Recent studies indicate that many biological communities are actually fire adapted. So when you take fire away, they lose the ability to manage themselves. And as I said in a previous video, the understories become so thick that in the event there is a fire, instead of it just participating in nutrient recycling and cleaning up the understory, all life as that ecosystem knows it is completely obliterated. Some species actually require that heating just so that their seeds will sprout. Today, about 40% of all federal lands are at risk of severe fires, something that we can relate to in the state of California. Many Americans are moving to remote areas, and 40 million now live in areas where there's a high wildfire risk. So as we suppress wildfires, we're basically building a tinderbox that can go off at any time. And now it's not just forests that are at risk, but people who are at risk as well. So that brings us to the ecosystem management piece of all of this. Ecosystem management really attempts to integrate sustainable ecological, economic, and social goals in a unified approach to protecting the entire ecosystem as opposed to a single part. We're going to manage things across the whole landscape using ecological processes over ecological timescales. We have to take into consideration human needs and promote sustainable economic development. We want to maintain our biological diversity and our ecosystem process. So, as we think about ecosystem management, at the end of the day, it's all about utilizing cooperative institutional arrangements. This ecosystem management idea can be complex as we generate meaningful stakeholder and public involvement, facilitating collective decision making. Now, that means you've got to get everybody who's involved in, protecting the ecosystem to agree. And sometimes getting two people to agree on anything, It can be as hard as pulling teeth. We have to adapt our management over time based on conscious experimentation and routine monitoring, which means that we can't just set a plan in motion and walk away and simply hope for the best. We have to go back and use conscious experimentation and monitor the area frequently to make adjustments to the plan as needed and sometimes on the fly. Let's look at the grasslands as a case in point. Grasslands occupy about a fourth of the world's land surface, and remember, they're, well, heavily impacted by people as we use them for crops, urban areas, and other human uses. The rate of disturbance of grasslands is actually 3 times that of the tropical rainforest, and so if you thought we were losing a lot of rainforest fast, think again. We're losing grasslands even faster. And probably the number one reason why we're losing grasslands is overgrazing. Grazing, well, it can actually be done in a sustainable way if humans, ranchers, pay attention to the activities of their animals and move them through a space with regularity rather than let them just sit there and eat the vegetation into oblivion. I hate to say it, but cows aren't smart. So they don't look at a pasture of grass and go, well, I'm just going to eat a little bit and then keep moving. Cows are also lazy. So if there's a whole lot of grass at their feet, they're just going to eat the grass all the way down to the soil until there's nothing left. Cows just eat and eat and eat. They're like a conveyor belt for grass. It just keeps going in one end and out the other. So as a result of raising cattle on the grasslands, we often see overgrazing, which leads to desertification. 75% of the rangelands in the world are degraded due to overgrazing. 55% of U.S. public rangelands, which can be related to our activity in this class called the tragedy of the commons, are in poor or very poor condition because, well, how do we make money as a rancher? I raise cattle, they get big and fat, and then I sell them on the open market. So the more cattle I can raise, the fatter they get, the more money I can make. So I'm going to keep trying to sneak more and more and more of my cattle into these public rangelands because I make more money. Tragedy of the commons. Grazing fees charged for the use of public lands are actually below market value and represent kind of a hidden subsidy to ranchers. So they're not even having to pay heavy fees to put their cattle out in these fields. Ranchers claim that without a viable ranch economy, well, the western lands would be further subdivided and, well, people probably wouldn't like the price they were paying for meat. When you think about how to live in harmony with the grasslands and still be able to raise cattle, well, there are new grazing methods that we can employ to do that. When cattle graze freely as opposed to being fenced in, they can eat the tender grasses, leaving the tough species to gradually dominate the landscape. And if they can graze freely, the thought is maybe they will wander around enough so that, well, grass can survive. If you fence them in, no such luck. Rotational grazing combines animals to a small area for a day or two before shifting them to a new location. This can actually be beneficial, right? Because you're going to push them to keep them moving rather than just stand there and eat until you're happy, right? Some plant communities, like in the desert Southwest, well, they can't tolerate grazing at all, but yet cattle are put out there anyway. We can raise wild species such as bison, which actually forage more efficiently than cattle do and can protect themselves from predators, disease, and pests better than cattle if we wanted to improve our grazing strategies. This is just a graphic to kind of show you rangeland degradation across the globe, comparing the world, Africa, Asia, South America, Europe, all to North America, and how degraded our soils are as a result of overgrazing. And you can see worldwide, soil degradation due to overgrazing is basically sitting at about 35%, with 65% coming from other causes. That doesn't sound like much, but you put that on the scale of hectares of land and you start to realize that this is a big deal. Here's a picture of rotational grazing, just to kind of give you an idea how it works. This livestock is fenced into a small area, and then after a day of like being able to kind of feast there, they're going to be pushed to another space. Alright, last thing in this section of notes, or this video, is to talk about parks, preserves, and then some of those aquatic ecosystems. So 12% of the Earth's land area is protected. That means that it's somehow wrapped up into parks and preserves. These have different kind of like rules about their use, so I'll kind of take you through those here down at the bottom. There are categories of protection that are shown with allowed human impact or intervention indicated here. If you have an ecological reserve and a wilderness area, then you basically are not really allowing anybody in it. There's little or no human impact. National parks, it's also low. People are allowed in these spaces, but it's monitored. National monuments and archaeological sites, low to medium. Habitat and wildlife management areas, it's medium. And then cultural or scenic landscapes, recreational areas, it's medium to high. Growth in protected areas is increasing. We're seeing growth, worldwide. People are starting to understand the importance of protecting ecosystems and developing these parks and protecting wildlife. And so we're starting to see more and more parks and preserves across the globe. And I really give credit to like your generation for that, because you're starting to recognize that we're losing plant and animal species hand over fist, and this is one way to protect them, to create a preserve that basically isolates an ecosystem or a space and says, people stay out, let Mother Nature basically like do her thing. Okay. In the developing world, some parks, they exist only on paper because they really don't have money or staff to manage the park, but at least the idea is there. Brazil has the largest protected area with more than 25% of the world's tropical forests. So Brazil's doing everything they can to protect what forests they have by setting it aside in parks and preserves. There are some biomes that are actually really well represented in nature preserves, whereas others not so much. Okay, so preserves are actually not safe from exploitation. They can still be leased out for grazing. They will oftentimes experience dam construction, oil drilling, mining, logging. Coral reefs can be damaged by dynamite fishing and ocean bleaching. Hunting still goes on preserves, and the public still overuses these preserves. So when it comes to the overuse of national parks and preserves, really we get to fight again with human desire for entertainment and economic gain. Entertainment, when you think of overuse of national parks, has actually trumped natural protection. So if Yosemite National Park was out there and we were talking about how beautiful it is, and then we sat there and said, well, no one's allowed to go, you'd have a whole bunch of unhappy campers telling you, who are you to say that I can't go see what's considered one of the wonders of the world in the form of Yosemite National Park. Fire suppression's a big deal in national parks. Like, people move in to these areas and they're using it for like tourism and making money, so we don't want them to burn. Traffic congestion's a big problem. Yosemite National Park, again, is a case in point. Others like Yellowstone literally see millions of visitors a year. Surrounding areas are clear-cut or mined for economic gain. Air pollution and smog, those are problems. Parks are profitable, but you don't really get to keep the money that they generate. If it's a national park, it goes off to the national level, not the local area. So local economies really only benefit from tourists that go to the area if I build a hotel or something like that outside that space. This is visitors to Yellowstone National Park in Geyser Basin, right? And you can just see how many people are lining the Geyser Basin. So millions of people visit these things every single year. The World Conservation Strategy. This was developed by the IUCN. Basically has 3 objectives: maintain ecological processes and life support systems, preserve genetic diversity essential to improving cultivated plants and domestic animals, and ensure that utilization of wild spaces and ecosystems is sustainable. That's how we're going to protect these ecosystems. Now, the last couple of slides here are all on marine ecosystems who still need protection because realistically they're not being protected very well. So global fish stocks are becoming depleted, and biologists are calling for protection in these areas where species can be sheltered. 20% of nearshore territory should actually be marine refuge, but none of it is. The refuge could replenish nearby areas, but it's not, because it's still being used for commercial fishing and like entertainment for people. 90% of coral reefs are threatened by rising sea temperatures, destructive fishing, coral mining, and the like. If conditions persist, coral reefs will be gone in 50 years. We need to take steps now to protect them. Some countries are establishing large marine reserves, especially to protect coral reefs. Australia is probably the leader in this because they have the biggest reef to protect, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. In 2007, the U.S. declared 3 national marine monuments in U.S. territories in the Pacific. Altogether, though, marine reserves still only make up about 10% of the world's protected areas, even though oceans cover 70% of the Earth's surface. So you can see, folks, there's still a lot of work to be done. All right, we're going to bring it to a close here. I hope you've learned a little bit about the ecosystem strategies needed to protect biodiversity and sustain biodiversity and some of the threats that different ecosystems are under. I'm Mr. Kennedy, and I'll see you next time.